guys, and welcome back to another Rebel Show. We're doing well here, like always, and hope you're doing awesome. It's been snowing a lot here in Colorado, and we're on a snow day. So I thought it'd be a good idea to film an episode. And we've just got a few days till Thanksgiving, so I hope everybody out there is thinking of all the good foods to eat, and more importantly, all the things they're thankful for. Because as crazy it is in the world, and even in America, the United States of America, we have a lot to be thankful for. So, happy Thanksgiving, everybody. So today I want to talk a little bit about the early Israelites, way back in the day, before they were actually in Israel. They were in Egypt. So here we go. In Genesis 41 and 47, there's a great account of the Israelites that I just want to go through a little bit. This is when Pharaoh was in desperate need of a dream interpretation. Joseph stepped in and interpreted. Now, at this point, Joseph had been sold into slavery by his brothers because they were jealous of some dreams he had and he told them about. And after a long process, Potiphar buys him. He becomes very successful working with him. He's accused of basically a sexual crime, thrown in the dungeon. And then when Pharaoh needs to interpret of a dream, I believe it was like his baker or the cupbearer, one of the two, remembered, hey, this guy, Joseph, knows how to interpret dreams. So he does that, and here we are. Now Joseph's been promoted to governor, which is basically the second highest position in Egypt. So Joseph went from his home to be sold in slavery, to be promoted, to be thrown into the dungeon, and then basically promoted to governor. Now, he was faithful to the things God showed him and told him, and he just stayed true to his wits and true to what God showed him, and it paid out well for him. So this move of him being promoted to governor basically saved Egypt and Joseph's family from famine that was to come, right? So his family had about 66 people, and not counting wives. That's in Genesis 46:26. And let's fast forward to chapter 47. This is when the famine got so bad that the Egyptians began to starve, all right? Because we in the United States have never dealt with a famine. We've had some fuel problems where there's lack of fuel and different things like that, but we've never had full-on famine where we're out of all our supplies total. And this is what these Egyptians are going through. So they gave Pharaoh all their money for food. So once they were not of food, they would go to Pharaoh and say, here's some money, let's buy some grain from you. And then the next year, they offered up their cattle in exchange for food, right? Later, their private estates. They said, Pharaoh, take our property, take our land, take our farms. And at this point, Pharaoh didn't own the property. It was still a private property type thing. The next year, the Egyptians offered their bodies as slaves to Pharaoh for food. And this is where Joseph brings the people in more locally, and they work, and he provides them food. So in these desperate times, these people's lives called for desperate measures, right? Famine came into these people's life, and they gave all they had for food. Their money, their possessions, their land and material possessions like farming equipment and stuff like that, and lives as slaves eventually at the end. So these people are trading their lives for food, basically. It's terrible. This is a terrible story, but it saved a lot of people. Genesis 47:11 and 12 says, so Joseph assigned the best land of Egypt, the region of Ramses, to his father and his brothers, and he settled them there, just as Pharaoh had commanded. And Pharaoh provided food for his father and his brothers, and the amounts appropriate to the number of their dependents, including small children. So here we see that Pharaoh respected Joseph so much that he basically gave him the choice of the land, and you can read this in these accounts. And so Joseph, of course, picked the best part of the land, and then he provided them with food. So they're not having to deal with the famine as harshly, or at all maybe, as their own Egyptians that actually basically possessed the land. The Israelites are being provided for even better. That's how God works, Through the famine, Joseph provided food for his family. So earlier in Genesis, God told Jacob, which is the father of Joseph, right? Genesis 46:3 says, I am God, the Father, the God of your father. He's talking about Abraham. The voice said, Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt, for I will make your family into a great nation. I will go with you down to Egypt, and I will bring you back again. So if you think through history, this is true. Jacob went down to Egypt, and maybe he personally didn't go back to the land of Canaan, which later on became the Promised Land, which Moses led the people out of Egypt. Joshua took them into the Promised Land. So the nation did, in fact, return, but it wasn't exactly Jacob leading them there. So at this point, we have God making a promise that, hey, I'm going to take you in there. You'll be successful. You'll be fine, but I'm going to bring you out. So they had a word from God that they would survive in Egypt. So this next little paragraph here is taken from the studylight.org website. If all the Egyptians had laid up corn and grain for themselves in the 7 years of plenty, they would have not been in these hard times. They didn't regard the warning of Joseph. So if Joseph knew and Pharaoh knew, these people, I'm sure, would have heard through the grapevine at least that there's a problem and we need to start dealing with it. As the people had no grain for their own sustenance, they would have had none for their cattle. The cattle were in danger of starving, and the people were in equal danger. They must have divided a portion they bought for themselves and with the cattle to feed both. They wished, of course, to preserve the cattle till the 7 years of famine should end. If they eat the cattle, there would be no cattle at the end of the famine. The cattle, being bought by Joseph, were supported at the royal expense, and very likely returned to the people at the end of the famine, for how would they be able to cultivate their ground and transport the merchandise? You know, that's slightly speculation, but it would make sense for Joseph to temporarily trade animals for the food, and then these people get their land and these animals back. So in times of crisis, a strong leader rises to help the people. In return, taking freedoms, rights, and prosperity. And that's what's happening here. These people, they didn't take heed to anything. They didn't prepare anything. And now guess what? They're in dire straits, right? At the time, Joseph's actions were good, and they had good intent, saving citizens of a nation. And in the end, a form of slavery, because Joseph instituted a tax on the people's labor and their production. This tax never ended. Once this was implemented, this still continued in Egypt throughout generations. In Genesis 48:26, it proves this by saying, Joseph then issued a decree, still in effect in the land of Egypt, right? That Pharaoh should receive 1/5 of all the crops grown in his land. So these people before owned their land and they could keep everything. Pharaoh didn't take anything from them. But through this crisis, they traded off their freedoms, and now, in return for it, now they have to pay a tax on what they produce, right? The Egyptians took no heed to the warning from Pharaoh's dream. Like, again, I would think if I owned a kingdom and we knew that there was going to be 7 years of famine, I would have told everybody is go out, prepare, get ready, save. It doesn't look like they did that. They didn't prepare a storehouse for food or food for cattle. There was no plans implemented to try to solve any of these problems. They had complete lack of personal responsibility. They were used to the good times. Complete lack of personal responsibility. Things in Egypt were easy. Why would they change? You know, they're just go with the norm. It's all good. They must have known Joseph was stockpiling grain. That's another thing. If Joseph, he had to get the grain from somewhere. Was he buying it? Was he buying it off these Egyptians? We don't know for sure, but he was stockpiling grain. I would think that'd be a pretty big operation to miss being an Egyptian, or at least read about. You know, they were lazy from the things being good, thinking we will be fine. Joseph will take care of us needed. You know, I'm taking a little bit of liberty there, but that's what I think happens to societies when they get a little overconfident in how things are going, is they get a little bit lazy and they depend a little bit too much. So they had no personal responsibility here. Egypt, in a sense, had a welfare system. And it turns out that they did because Joseph was wise enough to store food for these people when things got tough. And the cost was freedom of the people and taxes. So they went from being just free, owning private property, to basically having to sell that stuff for food and then get taxed when they got their possessions later. So it cost them. They lost freedom. They lost liberty. All right? That's the point I'm trying to make here. Is they traded freedom for they traded their freedoms and liberties for a temporary thing. That's what we want to get across. Chaos in the hands of an I will fix it leader will always lead to the loss of freedoms and another small step into slavery. As Americans, we need to be prepared to defend ourselves against injustice, but also provide for ourselves in times of trouble. So we should be having a stockpile of food and water and such in case there is a hard time. We depend on God, but we also prepare with wisdom. Joseph prepared with wisdom. The Egyptians didn't. And since he was in a position of power, he could provide his family with support because they had a word from God that says, we'll take care of you down there. We need a storehouse along with a support group, a well-armed militia, and a citizen at the pulpit willing to speak the truth. It's good stuff. So the point here is to take away is be careful not to trade a temporary satisfaction for your liberty, because it happens all over the world and it's beginning to happen here. Thank you very much.